The sneer on my father's face was as sharp and familiar as the edge of a blade. "And what of my other daughter, Elara?" he boomed, his voice echoing across the great hall of Thornkeep. He gestured dismissively toward me and my husband Liam, who stood beside me, quiet and unassuming. "She chose to bind our noble bloodline to this." He spat the word, not even deigning to look at Liam. "A commoner, a scribbler of histories with hands stained by ink, not glory. He is a leech upon this house, a useless man who brings nothing but shame." My sister Clara preened beside her fiancé, the smug and ambitious Duke Valerius. She wore a gown of spun gold that had been meant for me, and the Thorne family signet, a ring my father had just stripped from my finger and placed on hers. "It's a pity, father," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But Alara always had a taste for the gutter. It's only right that the future of our duchy rests with those who understand its worth." The assembled lords and ladies of the Northern Reach tittered, their laughter like 1,000 tiny cuts. They saw me as my family did, a fool who had thrown away her birthright for a penniless scholar. They saw my husband as a weakling, a man who stood silently and absorbed the insults, his face a calm, unreadable mask. For 2 years I had endured this. The whispers, the insults, the casual cruelty. But this was different. This was a public disinheritance. This was my father naming Valerius, a man whose soul was as rotten as his ambition was vast, as the heir to our lands. He was casting me and the man I loved out into the cold, destitute and disgraced. My hand tightened on Liam's arm. His was the only warmth in a world that had turned to ice. He didn't flinch, he didn't rage. He simply covered my hand with his own and gave it a gentle squeeze, his eyes fixed on the great oak doors at the end of the hall. It was this stillness in him, this deep, unshakable core, that infuriated them the most. They mistook his patience for weakness. They had no idea who they were mocking. And as the doors to the hall suddenly swung open with a force that rattled the chandeliers, I allowed myself the smallest, most secret of smiles. My family thought this was their moment of triumph. In truth, it was the beginning of their end. My life in Thornkeep had been a long, slow suffocation. I was the second daughter of Duke Alastair Thorne, a man who measured worth in titles, lands, and strategic marriages. My mother, the Duchess, measured it in beauty and social grace. I was found wanting on all counts. My older sister Clara was their masterpiece. She had our mother's fiery hair and our father's cunning ambition. She could charm a visiting dignitary and ruin a rival's reputation with a single, well-placed whisper. She was the sun, and I was the shadow she cast. From our earliest days, I was the designated failure. If a tutor praised my grasp of statecraft, he would be quietly dismissed and replaced by one who focused solely on Clara's brilliance. The gowns I designed in my sketchbook would appear weeks later on Clara, who would claim the idea as her own, earning our mother's fawning approval. When I showed a surprising talent for archery, my bow was found mysteriously broken the morning of the royal tournament. "Such a clumsy girl," my mother had sighed while Clara went on to win the silver arrow. They didn't just neglect me, they actively sabotaged me. It was a systematic campaign to grind down my spirit, to ensure I would never outshine their perfect heir. I learned to make myself small, to blend into the tapestries, to find solace not in the grand halls but in the dusty, forgotten corners of the castle library. It was there, amidst the scent of old paper and leather, that I met Liam. He wasn't a lord or a knight. He was an assistant to the royal historian, sent from the capital to catalog our family's extensive archives. He had kind eyes the color of moss after a rain, and hands that, while ink-stained, were gentle and sure. Unlike everyone else in my life, he didn't look at me and see a duke's disappointing daughter. He saw Elara. He asked about the books I was reading, listened to my thoughts on the fall of the old dynasties, and laughed at my quiet, sarcastic jokes. He was the first person who didn't want anything from me. He didn't care about my title or my dowry. He cared about my mind and my heart. We fell in love in hushed whispers between bookshelves, our courtship a secret rebellion written in the margins of forgotten texts. When I told my family I intended to marry him, the explosion was cataclysmic. "You would throw yourself away on him?" My father had roared, his face purple with rage. A nobody? You will bring a commoner into this family, into these halls? He is a good man, father. He is honorable and kind, I had pleaded. Kindness doesn't defend a border. Honor doesn't fill the treasury, he bellowed. You are a fool, Ilara, an utter and complete fool. My mother was colder, her cruelty more precise. If you marry this person, she hissed, her eyes like chips of ice, you are on your own. You will receive nothing from us. No title, no allowance, no standing. You will be a stain on our name. I married him anyway. It was the one and only time I had ever defied them. They were true to their word. We were given a small, drafty set of rooms in the most neglected wing of the castle. We were seated at the far end of the table during feasts, if we were invited at all. My old gowns were given to Clara's maids. My family's campaign of quiet sabotage turned into a loud, relentless assault of public humiliation. At every opportunity, they mocked Liam's simple clothes, his scholarly pursuits, his lack of a title. They called him my useless husband, a pathetic creature I had chained myself to out of pathetic defiance. Through it all, Liam remained serene. He would endure their scorn without a word, and then, in the privacy of our rooms, he would take my hand and tell me stories of ancient kings and forgotten queens, his voice a calm anchor in my turbulent world. I never regretted my choice, but I began to despair, seeing no way out of the gilded cage where I was doomed to watch my tormentors flourish. The turning point came not with a whisper, but with a royal decree that shook the entire kingdom. King Theron, old and childless, had passed away in his sleep. His death left a vacuum of power, with a dozen ambitious dukes and lords sharpening their blades, ready to plunge the realm into a bloody civil war. But the king's royal council, led by the high priest, invoked the ancient covenant of the founders. According to the oldest laws of the land, when the royal line failed, a new king would not be chosen by war or politics, but by destiny. The Blade of Kings, a sword of mythical origins named Veritas, was embedded in the Primus stone in the capital's central square. It was said that only a true descendant of the first king, one with the blood of the founders flowing in his veins, could draw it forth. A grand summons was issued. Every man of noble birth was invited to the capital to try his hand. The one who drew the sword would be crowned the undisputed king of Eldoria. My family saw this not as a crisis, but as the ultimate opportunity. Valerius, my father announced at a family dinner, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. You are descended from 3 ducal lines. Your blood is as noble as any in this kingdom. You will be the one to draw the sword. Clara clapped her hands in delight. My husband, the king, she squealed, and I, his queen. Duke Valerius, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty, puffed out his chest. It is only my duty, he said with false modesty, for the good of the realm. A cold dread washed over me. I had seen Valerius torture a stable boy for being too slow with his horse. I had heard him boast about ruining a lesser lord over a disputed acre of land. A man like that on the throne would be a catastrophe. His reign would be one of fear and blood, with my father and sister whispering poison in his ear. That evening, during the grand feast my father threw to announce Valerius as our family's champion, the humiliation reached its peak. Valerius, drunk on wine and his own ego, cornered Liam by the hearth. Tell me, scribe, he sneered, loud enough for half the room to hear, what will you do when I am king? Perhaps I'll make you my royal fool. It's a role you seem born to play. My father and Clara laughed. Liam simply looked at him, his gaze level. You should be careful what you wish for, my lord, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an odd weight. A crown can be heavier than a mountain. Valerius, enraged by Liam's lack of fear, shoved him hard. Liam stumbled back, catching himself on the mantelpiece. A small, intricately carved wooden bird fell from his tunic and clattered onto the stone floor. It was a gift I had carved for him on our first anniversary. Clara let out a shriek of derisive laughter. Look, the little scholar carries dolls with him. How precious. That was it. The last thread of my restraint snapped. To be insulted was one thing. To be assaulted and have a symbol of our love mocked was another. I stormed over, placing myself between Valerius and my husband. "That is enough," I said, my voice trembling with a rage I hadn't felt in years. Later that night, in the quiet of our cold rooms, the fury had not subsided. It had hardened into a cold, clear resolve. "I cannot let this happen, Liam," I whispered, pacing the worn rug. "I can't let them win. Valerius will destroy this kingdom. My family will help him." I stopped and turned to him. He was sitting by the fire, watching the flames, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "There is more to you than you let on. I've always felt it. That calm you have, and it's not weakness, it's strength. Who are you, really?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and looked up at me. "My love," he began, his voice low. "I never wanted this life. The only throne I ever desired was a quiet chair beside you. But you are right. Your family's darkness is about to swallow the light." He stood up and walked towards me. He unbuttoned the cuff of his simple linen shirt, pulling the sleeve back to reveal his wrist. There, stark against his skin, was a birthmark, a swirling shape I had seen 100 times but never truly recognized. It was the shape of a sleeping dragon. "My real name is not Liam," he said softly. "It is Arik of House Targan. My family were the kings of Eldoria before they were slaughtered in the Dragon's Purge a generation ago, betrayed by a coalition of ambitious lords. I was the only one smuggled to safety, raised in secret by the royal historian, hidden in the one place no one would ever look for a king, a library." I stared at him, at the dragon on his wrist, the symbol of the ancient royal line, and everything clicked into place. His encyclopedic knowledge of history, his fluency in the old tongue, his quiet dignity that no insult could pierce. It wasn't the meekness of a commoner. It was the unshakable confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. "You are the true king," I breathed, my heart pounding. "I didn't want to be," he said, taking my hands in his. "But to protect you, and to stop men like Valerius and your father from tearing this kingdom apart, I will be what I was born to be." He met my eyes, his own filled with a fire I had never seen before. They wanted a king. They are about to get one. The journey to the capital city of Ethelgard was a grand procession of arrogance. My father, Duke Alastair, rode at the head of a column of 500 thorned soldiers, their banners snapping in the wind. Beside him, Duke Valerius sat his war horse as if he already wore the crown, accepting the cheers of the small folk with a magnanimous wave. My sister Clara, in a carriage lined with velvet, looked every bit the future queen, basking in the attention. Liam and I followed at the very rear in a simple, unmarked carriage, as if we were little more than servants. My family had insisted on it, another small cruelty to remind us of our place. But for the first time, their pettiness didn't sting. It felt pathetic. We were not at the back of the procession. We were the coming storm, gathering strength in the silence. Ethelgard was a sea of humanity. The great square before the royal citadel was packed with nobles and commoners alike, all drawn by the promise of history in the making. In the center of the square, on a dais of white marble, was the Primus Stone. It was an ancient, unadorned block of granite, and from its heart rose the hilt of a sword. Veritas, the blade of kings. Its pommel was a simple sphere of unpolished silver, its grip wrapped in worn, dark leather. It looked plain, almost humble, yet it held the destiny of the entire realm. One by one, the great lords of Eldoria stepped forward to try their luck. Lord Tyrell of the West March, a man said to be strong enough to wrestle a bear, grasped the hilt and pulled. The veins in his neck bulged, his face turned the color of a plum, but the sword did not move. Sir Caelan the Valiant, the greatest knight in the kingdom, tried next, praying to the gods of strength before his attempt. He failed. Dozens tried, from swaggering young heirs to grim-faced old warlords. Each one left the dais defeated, their pride shattered. Finally, the royal herald called, "Duke Valerius of the House of Corvin, champion of the ducal House of Thorn." My father stood tall, his chest puffed with pride. He gave a sweeping speech, his voice booming across the silent square, proclaiming Valerius's noble lineage, his strength, his destiny to unite the fractured kingdom. Valerius strode onto the dais, soaking in the moment. He smirked, winked at my sister, and then wrapped both of his large hands around the hilt of Veritas. He pulled. Nothing. He grunted, adjusting his grip, and pulled again, his entire body trembling with the effort. The sword remained as immovable as the mountain from which the stone was hewn. He let out a roar of frustration and yanked with all his might, his face contorted in a mask of fury and desperation. There was a faint groaning sound, but it was not the sword. It was the sound of Valerius's own sinews screaming in protest. He staggered back, panting, his face pale with humiliation. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of disappointment that quickly curdled into quiet mockery. My father's face was a study in horror. Clara looked as if she'd been slapped. This was not how their glorious story was supposed to go. As they stood frozen in their public failure, Liam, or Arik as I now knew him, stepped out of our carriage. He walked calmly through the crowd, his simple scholar's robes a stark contrast to the silks and armor around him. "Out of the way, commoner!" a thorn guard barked, moving to block his path. Arik didn't stop. He held up his hand, revealing the signet ring of the royal historian, a ring that granted him access to any sacred site in the kingdom. The guard faltered, confused. My father saw him, and his face contorted with rage. "What is the meaning of this? Seize him! How dare this useless cur approach the sacred stone?" But the high priest, a wizened old man who had seen a century of kings come and go, held up a hand. "Let him pass," he commanded, his ancient eyes fixed on Arik with a strange, intense curiosity. Arik walked past the guards, past my sputtering father, and stepped onto the dais. He ignored the gasps and whispers of the crowd. He ignored Valerius, who was staring at him with a look of murderous disbelief. He simply approached the Primus stone. He placed one hand on the silver pommel. He did not pull or strain. He did not grunt or heave. He lifted. With a sound like a long-held breath being released, Veritas slid from the stone. The blade, which had looked dull and gray, now blazed with an inner light, revealing intricate glowing runes that snaked along its length. Arik held it aloft, and the light seemed to wash over the entire square. A collective gasp went through the crowd, a sound of pure awe. And then, Arik pushed back the sleeve of his other arm, revealing the swirling dragon birthmark on his wrist. The high priest fell to his knees. "It is him!" he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. "The blood of the founders has returned. All hail King Arik of House Targan, the true king of Eldoria." My family was paralyzed. My father's face had gone from red to a ghastly, bloodless white. My mother clutched her throat, and Clara simply stared, her mouth agape in a silent scream. Valerius looked at the glowing sword, then at Arik, and the realization of what he had done, of who he had tormented, dawned in his eyes, replaced by pure animal terror. Arik turned, his eyes sweeping over the kneeling crowd, but they didn't stop until they found me. He held out his free hand. His voice, now amplified by the unnatural silence of the square, was clear and strong, filled with the love that had been my only shelter. "Alara," he called, "my queen." The royal guard, who moments before had served my father, now saw their true sovereign. Their captain bellowed, "Kneel for the king, kneel for the queen." And as one, the mightiest soldiers in the land dropped to one knee, their heads bowed to me. They then rose, their mission clear. They formed a ring of steel, not around their new king, but around my father, my mother, my sister, and Duke Valerius. Their faces were grim. The charge wasn't just lèse majesté for insulting a king. It was treason, for attempting to place a usurper on the throne, and for years of abuse against the woman who was now their queen. My victory was not one of my own making, but of my own choosing. I had chosen love. I had chosen kindness. I had chosen a useless man, and in doing so, I had just saved the entire kingdom. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of the royal citadel, looking out over a city at peace. The banners of House Targan, a golden dragon on a field of crimson, now flew from every tower. My husband, King Arik, had been true to his word. His reign was one of justice and wisdom. He lowered taxes on the common folk, rebuilt the kingdom's crumbling infrastructure, and established a council where even the smallest landowners had a voice. The people, starved for a just ruler, adored him. And I, Queen Alara, stood beside him not as a mere consort, but as his most trusted advisor. The knowledge of statecraft my father had tried to stifle was now used to help govern a realm. The compassion they had mocked was now the bedrock of our court. Our victory was total, and the fate of our enemies was swift and fitting. Duke Valerius was tried for high treason. His plot to seize the throne was laid bare for all to see, and he was executed at dawn. With his death, House Corvin was dissolved, its lands forfeited to the crown. My father, Duke Alastair Thorne, was stripped of his titles and his lands. He was not killed, but given a punishment Auric deemed far worse: powerlessness. He was exiled to a remote, Spartan monastery on the Grey Cliff coast, condemned to a life of silent contemplation, with nothing but his bitter regrets for company. My mother, the Duchess Isolde, could not bear the fall. Her identity was so intertwined with her status that its loss shattered her mind. She now resided in a quiet, secluded sanatorium, tended to by gentle healers lost in delusions of her former glory. As for Clara, her world had utterly collapsed. With no title, no dowry, and the black mark of treason attached to her name, no noble house would have her. She was cast out, forced to make her own way in a world she had never been taught to navigate. Word reached me that she had found work as a barmaid in a grimy port town on the southern coast. One day, I traveled there, cloaked and unannounced. I found her in a noisy, squalid tavern, her once immaculate hands raw and red from scrubbing pots, her fiery hair dull and tied back in a greasy scarf. She was serving ale to drunken sailors, her face a permanent mask of sullen resentment. She saw me, and for a moment her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into the familiar glare of hatred. But there was something new there, too: defeat. She turned away without a word, unable to even meet my gaze. I hadn't come for an apology or to gloat. I had come to see for myself that the ghost of my past no longer had any power over me. I left a single gold coin on the table and walked away, feeling not pity or triumph, but a profound sense of release. That evening, I returned to the palace. Auric was waiting for me in the royal library, the place where our story had truly begun. He took my hands, his touch as warm and steady as ever. "They are broken," I said quietly. "All of them." "They broke themselves, my love," he replied, his voice soft. "They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance, they couldn't see the truth right in front of them." He smiled, the same kind, gentle smile that had first captured my heart amongst the dusty tomes. "They mocked you for marrying a simple scholar, but they forgot that scholars are the keepers of history. And history has a way of reminding everyone who they truly are." He led me to the balcony, and we looked out at the stars glittering over our sleeping kingdom. The royal sword, Veritas, was sheathed at his hip, a symbol not of power, but of the truth we had brought back to the world. They had called him useless, a man of no consequence. But my love for him, my unwavering belief in his quiet strength against all their scorn, had been the key that unlocked the kingdom's destiny. My family had tried to write me into a tragedy, but I had chosen to write my own story, and it was a love story that had become the salvation of a nation.